Hi, everyone. In this video lecture, we're going to focus on the glands or organs of the endocrine system. Now, you might remember that the endocrine system has some primary structures that are going to secrete hormones, which remember, hormones are the chemical messengers of the endocrine system that help coordinate functions throughout the organism. There are also going to be some secondary structures that we'll touch upon a little later. Those secondary structures are going to include organs like the heart, and the digestive tract, for example, which contain endocrine cells that contribute to endocrine function. But for right now, we're going to focus on the main glands of the endocrine system. So we're going to talk about the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, thyroid gland, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, the pineal gland, and the parathyroid glands. And if you need a reminder, there's a great diagram in your Martini's visual anatomy textbook. I think it's module 16.3, where you can kind of get a quick glimpse and see all of those different glands and where they are located. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus, you might remember from A&P1, is part of your brain, and it is going to have both direct and indirect control of endocrine organs. So there are two ways that it will have indirect control, and then one mechanism of direct control in terms of endocrine organs. So first, let's think about the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So don't mix up hypothalamus and pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is going to control the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is the structure where we're going to see the secretion of hormones out into the bloodstream based on the directions of the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus does actually secrete some hormones. They're called regulatory hormones, and those hormones will go to the anterior lobe, for example, and determine whether or not the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland will secrete hormones. And then the hypothalamus also has the ability to actually synthesize two hormones, which are going to be the antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. We will be talking about those in this unit, but we will also be talking about those in other units as well. So one of the things about the endocrine system that you need to keep in mind is that it is pretty challenging. There are so many hormones to learn, but you're not going to have just one chance to learn them. This is your first chance, but then we're going to see most of these hormones at least one more time over the semester. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so those two hormones, ADH and oxytocin, that the hypothalamus can secrete, those hormones from the hypothalamus actually will go to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and that is where they are stored. So for indirect control, then, the hypothalamus can make ADH and oxytocin, which will travel to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and from there they can be released into the blood supply and impact target cells. ADH, by the way, is antidiuretic, so it's going to help you hold on to your I can't talk. It's going to decrease your urine volume so that you can increase your blood volume. So antidiuretic, you're going to hold on to water instead of releasing the water in your urine. Oxytocin is going to be super important in labor and delivery, but it's also like the hug hormone. So if you hug someone for, say, 60 or 90 seconds, you'll often get a little release of oxytocin, and it's one of the reasons why people connect and feel bonded to one another, including moms and babies. So oxytocin has some really interesting context to it. So those are those two from the posterior lobe of the pituitary. The anterior lobe of the pituitary itself is capable of secreting actual hormones, okay? So it's going to actually make by secrete, we mean make. So it's going to make a whole bunch of hormones, and we're going to talk about those hormones, but it's going to include things like thyroid stimulating hormone and FSH and LH, which are going to be important in reproductive system. It's going to include growth hormone. Just as a couple of examples, those are all going to be made in the anterior lobe, but the release of those hormones will be determined by the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus will do that using regulatory hormones that are made in the hypothalamus. And there are stimulating regulatory hormones and there are inhibitory regulatory hormones. So you can probably figure out which one the hypothalamus will release depending on whether it wants to have the anterior lobe secrete or not secrete those hormones. Now, the last way that the hypothalamus can control endocrine organs is through direct control. What we mean by direct control is there are actual neuron fibers that go from the hypothalamus directly to cells in the adrenal glands, and that's what's being depicted over here with these red lines. So these are the motor fibers that are going from the hypothalamus to the adrenal glands, and if a signal is sent from the hypothalamus down those fibers, the impact in the adrenal gland is that epinephrine and norepinephrine will be released. And we will talk a little bit more about epinephrine and norepinephrine across the semester, realistically. Okay, so the pituitary gland then, also known as the hypophysis, I mean, I never call it that, but that is officially its fancy word. You might remember from A&P1 that the pituitary gland is found in the sella turcica structure of the sphenoid bone. So great opportunities to bring in stuff that you learned from A&P1 and tie it together for why we taught it to you in the first place. So here's our hypothalamus up here at the top, and then here's our pituitary gland. There's the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. And again, the hypothalamus is going to be kind of controlling both of these lobes. Now, the number of hormones from the pituitary gland is 9, 7 of them from the anterior lobe and 2 of them associated with the posterior lobe. All of those hormones will bind to receptors on cell membranes. So that means that target cells have a receptor displayed on the outside of their membrane, and those hormones can bind to that receptor. And all of them are going to use cyclic AMP as a second messenger to have an impact on cellular activity. So something will happen inside the cell as a result of the hormone binding to the receptor and activating cyclic AMP as a second messenger. Some structural names in terms of anatomy to be aware of is the term infundibulum. That's this little structure right here that's kind of like a bridge that connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. And then, of course, as I've already mentioned multiple times, we have the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Now, I mentioned there was a whole bunch of hormones that come from the anterior lobe. This is a great visual representation of those hormones. So all of these are made in the anterior lobe of the pituitary and released based on direction from the hypothalamus. So we have thyroid stimulating hormone, which will go to target cells in the thyroid and result in the production of thyroid hormone. We have the adrenocorticotropic hormone. This is going to activate cells in the adrenal gland. We have the gonadotropins, which include FSH and LH. This is follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. They are both in the reproductive system. They are associated both with male and females. And so, again, they're coming from the pituitary gland, and they will have major effects on targets in the reproductive systems like cells in the ovary and cells in the testes, and we'll talk about that when we talk more about reproductive systems. We're going to have growth hormone. This is going to be essential for the musculoskeletal system, but growth hormone's actually kind of interesting because what it does when you're young versus what it does when you're older is quite different. We're going to have prolactin. Prolactin is going to be important for stimulating the mammary gland and milk production. And we're also going to have melanocyte stimulating hormone. And honestly, we really never talk about it because nobody really knows what it does or why it does it. We know it impacts the target cell as melanocytes, but we're not really sure about the complete role. Okay, and then in that posterior lobe, good news is nothing's being made there. Hormones are only being stored and released. And again, those two hormones are the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and the target cells will be in the kidney. And then we have oxytocin, and most of the target cells for that are in the uterus, although there's probably also some brain areas that might be affected by oxytocin. Interesting little thing about both ADH and oxytocin is that each of them is only about 9 amino acids long. So these are very small molecules. I don't know, just interesting little fun fact there for you. Okay, now the other interesting thing about the hypothalamus and pituitary gland and their whole kind of complicated relationship is that both the nervous system which you've already learned about in A&P1 and the endocrine system primarily rely on negative feedback loops for regulation. So you might recall learning about negative feedback loops in the nervous system, but it looks maybe a little different in the endocrine system just because it has kind of an extra layer of complexity to it, or extra steps, if you will. So let's just look at this one example. So if we think about the hypothalamus, it's going to release a hormone. RH stands for regulatory hormone. Again, it could be a stimulating or inhibitory type of regulatory hormone. But in this case, it looks like this RH hormone coming from the hypothalamus is stimulating the anterior lobe to release hormone 1, right? I know this is stimulation because the key says that red arrows are stimulation. So the anterior lobe is stimulated by RH from the hypothalamus to release hormone 1. Hormone 1 targets some endocrine gland, doesn't matter, this is just an example. And when hormone 1 targets this endocrine gland, it causes that endocrine gland to secrete hormone 2. Again, it's all red arrows, so I know it's all stimulation. And then that hormone is going to impact the target cells of this hormone. But what's interesting to us in terms of negative feedback loops is the effect of hormone 2 and activity in the anterior lobe. So what we'll see is that hormone 2 actually shuts off or inhibits the initial hormone from the hypothalamus, as does activity in the anterior lobe. So in other words, if the hypothalamus stimulates the anterior lobe to release a particular hormone, the very process of stimulating the anterior lobe will ultimately shut down the mechanism that stimulated it. This means that we can hopefully be sure we're not going to overproduce hormone 2, that once we get enough hormone 2 to impact the target cells, then we will also inhibit the initial signal so that we don't keep making hormone 2. It's kind of like, the little boy who cried wolf, right? If you cry wolf all the time when there are no wolves, then people will eventually stop coming to help you because the message doesn't mean anything. So if hormone 2 is always around, then it won't be seen as a message by the target cells anymore. So we want to not have it always be around. So we got to shut down the system so that it's not always there. Okay, so that takes us to the thyroid gland. And before I get into the thyroid gland, I just want to point out that we just talked about 9 hormones. That's a lot of hormones, and you need to know them, all right? So you need to know their names. You need to know who or where they're made, and you need to know what their target is. And for most of them, you need to know something about what do they do to the target cells, like what's the impact of that hormone. So I really suggest that you make a big chart, like a big pretty chart. If you love color pens or post-it notes, you could really go crazy with this. But make a chart where you list all of the hormones we talk about in this PowerPoint. Then in another column have where are they made? Then in another column have where do they go? In other words, what are the target cells? Where are those target cells located? And then maybe the last column is what's the effect of that hormone? What do those target cells do in response to that hormone. And then if you're like me, because there's always some other random little piece of information I just need to also have, I always need a final column that's just like miscellaneous, and I jot down things that don't quite fit in anywhere else. But I promise you, charting information is a great way to learn and memorize. And ultimately, you got to memorize these hormones. Okay, so thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is like in your neck, right below your thyroid, right? So that thyroid cartilage, right below that. And if you reach up your hands, you can probably feel some kind of soft, kind of a little bit squishy things. And you're probably feeling your thyroid. This image does a pretty good job of showing you there's the thyroid cartilage, and right below that, kind of, right at the base of your neck, there is your thyroid gland. Inside your thyroid gland are lots of follicles. That's what these circles are here, surrounded by, are you ready? Simple cuboidal epithelium. It's A&P1 lab. I promised in A&P1 lab that you really needed to know this stuff, and here it is coming up again. So those simple cuboidal cells form these follicles, and because they're cuboidal cells, we can predict that they probably either secrete or absorb, because that's what cuboidal cells tend to do. And sure enough, these are secretors. So these cuboidal cells fill the follicle with what we call colloid. So this is thyroglobulin, a globulin in here, and it will ultimately form thyroid hormones T3 and T4. You don't need to know anything specific. Just call them thyroid hormones. The answer will never be T3 or T4. It'll just be thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormones are super important, both of them, for increasing oxygen and energy consumption. It's going to result in an increased heart rate, blood pressure, red blood cell formation, and actually thyroid hormones tend to stimulate other endocrine tissues. So these are kind of overall, we're going to see an increase in metabolism in response to thyroid hormone secretion. Another type of cell, though, in the thyroid gland are C cells, and they are found in between the follicle. So there's the simple cuboidal cells that create the follicle, and this is where T3 and T4 thyroid hormones are made. But in the mess in between the follicles are C cells, and those cells are going to produce calcitonin, which you also learned about in A&P1, because calcitonin is going to play a really important role in regulating blood calcium levels, and we will come back to that shortly. Okay, now, kind of posterior to the thyroid gland, almost like embedded in the back of the thyroid gland, is the parathyroid gland. Very similar sounding. And the parathyroid gland is going to make parathyroid hormone. So that's kind of easy. That's the good news there, but just be careful that you don't mix it up with thyroid and thyroid hormones and thyroid stimulating hormone from the pituitary, right? There's a lot of similar sounding things there to get straight. All right, in our parathyroid tissue, we are going to see two kinds of cells: parathyroid oxyphil cells. Kind of don't care about those. No one really knows what they do. I mean, I'm sure they do something really important. It's just not what we're going to focus on. We are going to focus on those principal cells, and those principal cells are what produce that PTH, and that PTH is going to increase blood calcium levels. So things to put in our mind already. PTH is going to increase calcium levels in the blood. Calcitonin is going to do the opposite. And again, this won't be the last time that we talk about it, because we have this slide right here where we can look at the effect of each of them. So let's say that our blood calcium levels are too high. That means homeostasis is disrupted because our blood calcium levels are too high. That will stimulate C cells in the thyroid gland to secrete calcitonin. The effect of calcitonin is that it causes the kidneys and digestive tract to alter their response to calcium. So if calcitonin is present, then the kidneys will excrete calcium, and also the digestive tract will not absorb calcium. So if we're not absorbing calcium and we are excreting calcium in our urine, the effect of that is that blood calcium levels will go down. And since our blood calcium levels were too high, that means we've returned our blood calcium levels to normal, and so we have restored homeostasis through the use of calcitonin. On the other hand, if homeostasis is disrupted because our blood calcium levels are getting too low, then that will cause principal cells in the parathyroid gland to secrete PTH. And if PTH is secreted, it will affect cells in the kidneys, the bone, and the digestive tract, but rather differently than calcitonin did, because PTH is going to cause the kidneys to hold on to calcium. So we're not going to let it go in the urine. We are also going to activate osteoclasts. And so the osteoclasts, remember that from A&P1, they're going to chew up the bone and release calcium into the blood. So that will help increase calcium levels. And at the same time, parathyroid hormone is going to increase another hormone called calcitriol. Don't mix that up with calcitonin, very similar sounding. Calcitriol is actually produced by the kidneys in response to PTH, and it causes more calcium to be absorbed by the digestive tract, which means we are adding calcium to our blood. So all three of these things are increasing blood calcium levels. And remember, our initial stimulus was that our blood calcium levels were too low. But now, in response to PTH, we've done all of these things to increase our blood calcium levels. And so homeostasis is restored. These are both examples of negative feedback loops that restore homeostasis when it's been disrupted. Okay, that brings us to the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands, of course, sit on top of your kidneys. They are retroperitoneal. So again, from A&P1, that means they are behind the peritoneum, the membrane. So they are kind of separated from a lot of your digestive tract, which is mostly encased by peritoneum. There are three major parts or layers or zones to the adrenal glands. We're going to have the outermost part, which is the capsule. And then underneath that, we're going to have the adrenal cortex. And the adrenal cortex actually has three zones. You can see the glomerulosa, the fasciculata, and the reticularis. That's a little more in depth than what we probably need to know for this class, but just be aware that there are multiple zones in the adrenal cortex. And then the deepest part of the adrenal glands is the adrenal medulla. And this is the area where epinephrine and norepinephrine are produced. And remember, we talked about epinephrine and norepinephrine at the beginning of this lecture when we talked about the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, and the direct control that the hypothalamus has on the adrenal glands. So remember, there are nerve fibers that travel from the hypothalamus to the adrenal glands that can stimulate the production of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla. Now, back in that adrenal cortex, you'll see that there are 24 corticosteroids that are produced there. You do not need to memorize the names of 24 glucocorticoid steroids. That's not happening. But we do want to be aware that corticosteroids include things like cortisol and cortisone. And these are important hormones that will help us regulate stress. They are anti-inflammatory. They help they alter metabolic function, which is both good and bad. It's really good in an initial stage of stress because it helps you deal immediately with that stress. But if those corticosteroids stay high, like they don't calm down after the initial stressor, that's where you can really have pretty negative impacts on the body because of those alterations to metabolism as a result of those glucocorticoids. So again, it's a little deeper than we probably need to go in this class. We're going to talk a little bit about the stress response later, but there's just some interesting stuff there. And so just to be aware that that's sort of, that these corticosteroids or glucocorticoids do play a really important role in our stress response. Okay, so kind of focusing on that, I do just want to point out that aldosterone is going to be important to us. We're going to talk about it more when we talk about kidney function in the urinary system. And again, remember that's connected to the hypothalamus. It's going to help us hold on to water. It's going to be part of that whole system with antidiuretic hormone as well. And then also we're going to have those glucocorticoids that I was just talking about. They are anti-inflammatory. That's one of their roles. Again, they also alter metabolic function and they also supplement growth hormone. Some of the glucocorticoids that you may have heard of include things like cortisol and hydrocortisone, corticosteroids, and cortisol. All of those are some things that you may be familiar with. They are steroids, which means that they can just slip through cell membranes and bind to receptors inside cells. And that's why when they're used as, a pharmacological agent, it's really important that they are appropriately and carefully used because they can affect cells. You can have unintentional effects from using some of these glucocorticoids. Okay, and then that brings us to the pancreas. Right about now, you're probably thinking, my God, there are so many endocrine glands. Yes, there are. There are lots of them. All right, so in the pancreas, which is located right here in this picture is the pancreas. This is sort of the tail and then the body of the pancreas. And you can see it sort of tucks in to the small intestine. Most of the pancreas is retroperitoneal, but not all of it. And also, part of your pancreas is kind of adjacent to your abdominal aorta, and that can be very problematic if you have any kind of tumor in the pancreas. If that tumor invades the wall of the abdominal aorta, that's a major issue and is difficult to treat. But right now, we're interested in the endocrine function of the pancreas because I should point out that the pancreas also makes a lot of digestive enzymes that we'll talk about in the digestive system. So we're just going to talk about the endocrine parts of it right now. That's going to have how about I put some words together? The digestive portion of the pancreas, those are all exocrine glands, but what we're talking about right now are endocrine glands. So remember, endocrine glands from A&P1 secrete into the blood supply. Exocrine glands secrete into ducts. So the endocrine portion of the pancreas includes what we call the islets of Langerhans. These are groups of cells in the pancreas. And in these islets of Langerhans, we're going to have alpha cells, beta cells, delta cells, and even PP or pancreatic polypeptide cells. And each of these cells will secrete a different hormone. The two that we're interested in are glucagon, produced by alpha cells, and insulin, produced by beta cells. And we're interested in those because these, of course, are the two main hormones that regulate our blood sugar levels. So just like when we looked at calcium levels a few slides ago, we can look at the exact same thing with blood sugar or blood glucose levels. So here we can see our homeostasis has been disrupted by blood glucose levels that are too high. The result of those high sugar levels or high glucose levels in the blood will cause beta cells in the pancreas to secrete insulin. Insulin will bind to receptors on pretty much all body cells. And the effect of that is that glucose will be transported into target cells at a greater rate. We will use glucose and generate ATP at an increased rate. Very importantly, we will increase the conversion of glucose to glycogen. And this is something that the liver does for us. And also by doing that, by taking all of the glucose and converting it to glycogen, it's a very effective way of lowering blood glucose levels. You'll also see that we're going to increase amino acid absorption and protein synthesis, and also will increase our triglyceride synthesis in adipose tissue. So remember, all of these things are going to use up glucose as well. And if you use it up, then that's going to decrease blood sugar levels, bringing us back to homeostasis. Now, we can also have the opposite issue, right? Our blood sugar or blood glucose levels could get too low. If they do, that will stimulate alpha cells in the pancreas to secrete glucagon. The glucagon mostly impacts liver, skeletal muscle, and adipose cells. And how those cells will respond is by increasing the breakdown of all the glycogen that was made previously back into glucose and putting it out into the blood supply for cells. And we will also increase the breakdown of fat into fatty acids because, of course, they can also be used for energy, but also that breakdown will release some glucose. And then we'll have an increased synthesis and release of glucose by the liver as well. So all three of these things will result in higher blood glucose levels, returning us to homeostasis. So again, just great examples of how negative feedback loops in the endocrine system work to coordinate and maintain homeostasis. Now, our last gland that we're going to talk about is the pineal gland. The pineal gland is this tiny little gland in the epithalamus of the brain. You might remember that from A&P2. There are cells in the pineal gland called pinealocytes, so that's pretty easy. And what they do is they synthesize melatonin. So they actually make melatonin from serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter found in the brain and produced by neurons. Melatonin plays some really important roles. It helps us regulate our circadian rhythm, so sort of when we're awake and when we're asleep, and then also seasonal circadian rhythms. Increases in melatonin are linked to seasonal affective disorder. So decreased exposure to light leads to increased production of melatonin. And for some people who are susceptible, that may lead to seasonal affective disorder. So light therapy is one way to treat it. Melatonin apparently plays a role in sexual maturation. We don't really fully understand this, but there's some really interesting things. So we know that we have decreased levels of melatonin in with puberty and higher levels of melatonin in children. Also, children who have like a tumor in the pineal gland that prevents the production of melatonin often exhibit early onset of puberty. So there's something there with melatonin and sexual maturation, but we just don't know all the details. Another really interesting thing about melatonin is that it's an amazing antioxidant that can protect us from nitric oxide and hydrogen peroxide. These are two metabolites that are normally produced through cellular processes, but that need to be cleaned up and to protect our cells because those chemicals are dangerous for our cells. And so, you may have heard that like sleeping is when your body kind of restores itself and heals itself. And melatonin may actually be like a really important part of that process, that while you're sleeping, increased levels of melatonin due to decreased light. By the way, your pineal gland has visual pathway fibers that come into it. So it has a direct connection to essentially your eyeballs. So it knows if it's light or dark outside. And that's one of the reasons why looking at screens at night is problematic, because it fakes your pineal gland into thinking that it's still light out, so you don't produce enough melatonin to sleep. And then while you're sleeping, all that melatonin is doing work. It's actually cleaning up all of this nitric oxide and hydrogen peroxide that's hanging out in your brain. So cool stuff, right? I know it's a lot. I know it's hard, but it's cool stuff. So focus on the coolness as you study, and that will help you remember it. And again, I beg you, make a big chart. You really have got to make a big chart for these hormones. Okay, this lecture ends here. I am going to make a separate and shorter video lecture for the clinical connections that we need to know about.